That's wonderful. Well, I'll give it a start. It's welcome everybody to our session on human rights education for the 21st century. It's been an incredible conference so far. We're coming to the end of it. It's hard to believe. Can't speak for the rest of you, but I've been deeply and profoundly impressed. The John Humphrey Center's done such a phenomenal job with this conference. I knew it was pitched as like the largest conference and a big one, but you had to really experience it, I think, to see the scale and the scope of this. Been a phenomenal job. So I don't know if we can do justice in like the final day of wrapping up, but we will endeavor to do so. Jen and I are going to speak for about 35, 40 minutes today. We'll go back and forth between the two of us to talk about a new project that we're very excited about that we've started this year, and we see immense potential moving forward. Essentially, it's hard to believe, it's been almost a year. We received a research grant to study human rights education from human rights institutions in Canada. So one of the things that's unique about this country when it comes to human rights law is that we have a series of human rights commissions or institutions whose job it is, among other things, to develop education and awareness. That may seem, of course, an obvious thing to most Canadians, but internationally, this is a unique and really quite impressive mandate. In fact, I'd even argue that, for reasons we can get into another day, Canada has arguably among the most sophisticated, not perfect, but sophisticated human rights legal regimes in the world. And one of the things that makes it so impressive is this mandate for education, this mandate for prevention. So Jen and I have been working. I myself am a professor of sociology at the University of Alberta. Jenna is a now finished master's student, congratulations, at the University of Calgary in sociology, planning on pursuing a PhD in the near future, which is great. And we've worked together to study these education programs produced by human rights institutions, so commissions, in Canada. We've interviewed people at every single commission, including territorial, across the country, which has been an exciting experience. And we've also done extensive research on everything from budgets to websites to annual reports to get a sense of what they're actually producing. So that is the purpose of our presentation today. We're going to introduce you to our project, tell you some of the exciting findings that we came across. And like I said, after about 30, 40 minutes, be very happy to take some questions. Among the many things you're going to hear from today is we've spent a lot of time working hard to collect budget data on commissions in Canada. Currently, there exists no sense of how funding or budgets compare among human rights commissions across Canada. For the first time ever, we're going to share that with you because we see a link between funding and educational resources. So some of the things we say today, for those of you who are practitioners and experts, may seem a bit self-evident, but I think it demonstrates a gap in scholarship and, most importantly, the potential for this work. So let me begin with a story that I came across many years ago when I started a book on the history of human rights law in Canada. It's one that's always stood out for me, and it comes to us from Duncan, British Columbia in 1984. And it seems topical, I think, to our conversation today. It begins with a man named Ian Johnston. It's about in his mid-40s, and in the early 1980s, owned and operated the Wessex Inn in Queechin Bay near Victoria, BC. It's just outside of Duncan. And in 1981, he hires Sherry Zarankin, a 17-year-old high school student, as a receptionist in a chambermaid. Now, in her testimony before a Human Rights Board of Inquiry, Zarankin describes Johnson's behavior as this. She says, quote, "He didn't have much respect for me. He was always rude and had a vulgar tongue. He just came up behind me and hit me on the bum and laughed and walked away. I was just standing there. He put his hand around my shoulder." End quote. So a year later, Zarankin confronts Johnson about his behavior. He promptly fires her. Now, according to staff who were called as witnesses before the inquiry, sexual harassment was a common practice at Wessex. Johnson's defense was that Zarankin was an incompetent employee. He did admit, however, that he routinely touched the female employees. The inquiry, which found him guilty, observed in their written judgment that, quote, "Sexual harassment in the workplace is not a new phenomenon, legal recourse for its victims is new. Now, a lot of things stand out for me in this case. Certainly not many 17-year-olds file human rights complaints. But more importantly was that even while sitting in a formal hearing, it never occurred to Johnson, granted this is the early 80s, it never occurred to Johnson to deny that he had treated Sarankin in the manner that she had described. So the case tells us a great deal about the challenges in confronting common sense notions of what is or is not discriminatory treatment. And it highlights the importance of human rights education. The Sarankin case should never have reached a hearing. Prevention through fostering a culture of rights using education is a far better solution than formal inquiries. As a leading scholar in the field has noted, quote, human rights education or the construction of a culture of rights is inherently revolutionary. If implemented effectively, it has the potential to generate social opposition alongside rising demands for justice. So Jen and I are going to speak today about our preliminary findings on Human Rights Commissions, or HRC's, educational programs. It's based on a survey of educational resources available on Commission's websites. We also reviewed annual reports, including financial reports. And as I mentioned, we've interviewed education officers in jurisdictions across Canada, including the territories. And our three primary research questions when collecting the data were, what is the trend in funding for human rights commissions in Canada? What tools are human rights commissions using for educational programming? What themes or issues are the primary focus of HRC's educational efforts? And what grounds of discrimination are currently prioritized in Commission's educational work? And in addition, the following are some of the tentative questions for our analysis. Is there duplication among Human Rights Commission's educational program? Are education materials specific to jurisdictions, or could they be used elsewhere? Does human rights education, or HRE, in Canada reference international treaties, or are we looking at just domestic content? And finally, to what degree, are human rights commissions contributing to developing a culture of rights in Canada? And finally, our primary objectives were partly to create a portfolio of good educational materials for sharing and collaboration, as well as identifying good practices, and to identify how academic research might benefit Human Rights Commission's educational work. So let's jump into it. Let's start, with a bit of context. Was the very first chair of the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission explained, this would have been about 60 years ago, 50, 60 years. They wrote, quote, the most important function of the commission would be this public education, would be the proactive changing of attitudes, of changing social values of the community, and being very much a human relations commission. Every inquiry into the enforcement of federal or provincial human rights law in Canada over the past 40 years has found that there's an overemphasis on individual complaints. Each report emphasized the essential role of education. Now, part of the challenge is defining HRE, human rights education. So if you look at the international scholarship, for example, there is a broad consensus around the idea that human rights education must include both content and processes related to human rights. So what does that mean? Well, human rights education should be cognitive, so the content, attitudinal or emotive, so share values, and action-oriented strategies. At its most basic, HRE imparts information about human rights norms and standards. It ensures awareness of what distinguishes human rights from the law, traditional values, or national constitutions. It includes a basic understanding of the history of human rights, struggles, and their main written expressions, like the Universal Declaration. Moreover, as one scholar has argued, quote, education about human rights cannot consist simply of rote learning of factual human rights information. but should instead place such knowledge within a culturally and contextually relevant setting. So the Universal Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training is perhaps the most recent iteration of how we should define human rights education. It provides a framework that specifies three characteristics. First is about, so providing knowledge of norms and mechanisms to enforce. Two is through, so teaching in ways that respect rights of educators and learners. And three, for, and that means empowering persons to enjoy and exercise their rights and to respect and uphold the rights of others. Now, the original design for human rights commissions in Canada was not to focus on punishment. I think that's something that's long been lost. We focus all on the complaints process and punishment. But that was not the original mandate or the primary mandate for human rights commissions, but it was to be education and transformation. You see this written in all the statutes. So a central aspect of education, to be sure, was informing the public about the law and what their rights were. But as we're going to discuss today, Human Rights Commission's educational mandates were also designed to foster a culture of rights. As the most recent inquiry into human rights commissions in Canada, this would be the 2017 report in BC, noted, many individuals do not know their own basic human rights. And even if they do not know what to do or where to go when those rights are violated. So as the Greshner report from Saskatchewan also noted, this is back in 96, a person, quote, cannot assert a right unless they know it exists. So within the scholarship on human rights education, it's generally understood that education is a vastly better strategy than individual cases when dealing with rights violations, especially in shifting the focus to systemic issues away from individuals. Despite this, pretty much every report commissioned by a federal or provincial government over the past 3 or 4 decades into their respective human rights statute has agreed pretty much on one issue. Education is less a priority for human rights institutions in Canada than it once was. The emphasis on processing cases is often to the detriment of other activities that disrupt systemic discrimination. And we hear this all the time when we speak and work with people who work in commission. So again, to quote that Greshner report from 96, excuse me, quote, relying only on individual complaints is an inefficient method of changing the underlying systems and practices that permeate institutions and organizations. So with that, I'm going to pass it on now to Jenna, who will start to share some of the findings that we've come across over the past year.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the findings amongst a whole host that we first want to talk about is the expertise among educational officers. So kind of continuing on in a little bit of the history, among the more notable trends with commissions in Canada since their establishment in the 1960s has been a shift towards hiring people with legal training. So previously, human rights investigators, commissioners, and even chief commissioners were originally from far more diverse backgrounds. So for example, we had the first chair of the BC Human Rights Branch/Commission, Kathleen Ruff, who was a former ombudsperson for the Vancouver Status of Women. And in her role, she primarily hired former activists of women's organizations. And then we also have Gertrude Keogh in Newfoundland, who was a homemaker, and their commission director was a lifelong public servant. And then lastly, Dan Hill was the first chair of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and he was a sociology professor at the University of Toronto. So who knows, perhaps we're among another chief right now. But in more recent years, chief commissioners and commissioners themselves are almost entirely legal experts. But it is worth noting that the diversity we once saw has now remains in educational officers themselves. And so through our interviews, the most common expertise that we saw was folks coming from backgrounds of social work, communications, policy studies, and also education. And so the next main issue that we tackled was finances and fundings to commissions. And so comparing across jurisdictions in Canada is definitely an imperfect process. In this graph, you see that the amounts for BC and Ontario include both the commission and the tribunal, which are separate but serve as a comparable function in other jurisdictions. And we have also included legal aid centers in BC and Ontario because they provide a function that is offered and funded by commissions in other jurisdictions. It's also worth noting that we are missing data on Quebec and federal tribunals because we're still waiting for FOIP requests there. But still, this visual representation is useful. And so the fact that BC's budget is higher than Alberta is remarkable. And it really highlights the really stark disparities in resources amongst jurisdictions across the country. And although Ontario funding is higher, when separated, the BC Commission's budget is higher than Ontario, which is interesting because the population of that province is almost a third. And so here is another way of looking at the information. Again, this visual is impressive because of BC's much smaller population size, which you'll note BC is the top right, I believe. So Quebec's commission is the only commission that has a budget line specifically dedicated to education, which in 2021 to 2022 was 1.6 million or 8.79% of their overall budget. And this includes salaries, but this number does require a little bit of further investigation because we aren't totally sure if the 1.6 million includes the salaries for all of their dozen or so staff, education officers, which, might eat away at that budget quite quickly. So it also helps to kind of put into effect the now defunct Alberta Human Rights Education and Multiculturalism Fund into perspective. So this fund used to provide grants and also funded some of the Commission's educational programming. And of about 1.8 million per year, almost half was used by the Commission to develop educational programming. But when you consider that this budget typically operates under 7 million and losing almost 1 million, this is a significant budget cut. And it's a stark reminder of the significance of losing that fund and also the ramifications it may have on human rights education. And also our conversations with education officers in PEI, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick highlight the remarkable disparities in funding despite having considerable mandates. And again, in New Brunswick, some demands of translation there. So we also see that the lack of resources for even simple outreach tasks seems to be a systemic problem. And this is evident when you have smaller jurisdictions who have to consider whether purchasing a software system like Zoom is within their budget in comparison to other jurisdictions who either have or had hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend directly on human rights programming. And so the obvious trend here is that the commissions have experienced a substantial decline in real dollars over the past 7 years. So in Alberta, for example, the budget in 2015 to 2016 was 6.5 million, and in 2021 to 2022 was 6.9 million. But when we correct these numbers for inflation, 6.5 million in 2015 is over 7.8 million in 2022. Which means that the Alberta budget has declined by approximately $1 million or 13% since 2015. So except for BC, PEI, and Quebec, commissions in Canada have faced real or actual funding declines. And when we look at Quebec, it is a modest increase at best. And so we are presuming that when overall budget declines, support for education is either static or reduced to support the demands of processing cases. And then finally, notable exception is the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And its budget has increased dramatically from 23 million in 2015 to 16 to 42 million in 2022 to 2023. So moving next away from budgets and more towards directly tools that are used for education. The primary tools that we either heard about through interviews or are like analyses of online web material. The most frequent tools include workshops, public statements, responding to media requests, websites, learning materials, which includes a whole host of things like PDFs, brochures, fact sheets, learning management systems, and posters. And then we also saw quite a few teachers' toolkits, online training sessions, and then the use of social media, which will be discussed in a little bit. But there are definitely some webinars and online courses. So for example, the Alberta Commission created a webinar on policy related to people experiencing disability within post-secondary institutions. But by far the most common and most frequently referenced tools was websites. And so similarly in Ontario, they offered training sessions on topics like racism, Indigenous spirituality, accessibility, and disability, and then also new policy that they created related to discrimination based on creed. And then since the onset of the pandemic, there has also been a shift to virtual webinars and e-learning sessions. So in March 2023, the Manitoba Human Rights Commission released 6 training sessions aimed at educating viewers on their legislation. And along the same lines, we see PEI's use of the Teacher's Toolkit, which again is in a few different jurisdictions, but we'll shed light on PEI for right now. So their toolkit is created, made in PEI, rights, responsibilities, relationships, and resources. And it was designed for teachers to use with elementary age children and their students. So in a collaboration with a whole host of parties, including the Department of Education and Lifelong Learning, the Public Schools Branch, the PEI's Teacher Federation, and the University of PEI's Faculty of Education, the PEI Commission created 4 toolkits on the Human Rights Act to share with young children. And then in addition to these toolkits, PEI offers the opportunity to have either virtual or in-person presentations by their education officers to the classrooms themselves to further that education. And another tool that's used for human rights education is fact sheets. Pretty well every single commission has fact sheets that can be distributed to either employers, employees, schools, and the public. And they can either be found through in-person work or also online through their websites. And so the content of these fact sheets range from general education, as seen in the New Brunswick Commission's fact sheet titled Introduction to the Grounds of Discrimination, and then all the way to Newfoundland's fact sheets, where they provide information on virtual hearings during the shift online as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But one tool or service that seems to be on the decline in several jurisdictions is providing policy reviews for employers. But losing staff and lack of resources has limited options in recent years in many jurisdictions. And a few other tools that we found interesting and that kind of stood out to us was two tools by Saskatchewan, including their business helpline. And then they also hosted a Courageous Conversation speaker series. However, the speaker series appear to have ended in 2018, so we're not sure if those are still ongoing. But there's also pre-recorded presentations of that are designed for post-secondary institutions as well, made by PEI. And although it isn't a commission themselves, it is worth noting and highlighting that the Canadian Museum of Human Rights has one of the best repositories for human rights education in the country. And it also is interesting in that it could be used by various jurisdictions and it's not limited to one space. And then moving on to social media. In terms of social media, commissions commonly use 4 platforms: YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. For many commissions, such as Newfoundland and Alberta, this appears to be an emerging tool. And it is also difficult to evaluate for Quebec because they have separate education and communication units, and the latter are responsible for social media. But amongst those 4, YouTube was the most commonly used platform. So the videos on these YouTube channels ranged from recorded Zoom presentations, such as Saskatchewan's presentation they did titled Enhancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Programs, to other commissions who have kind of created more formally produced videos with professional film agencies, such as the BC's Commission video titled Intro to Human Rights. And then moving on, Facebook and Instagram are the next most commonly used accounts, leaving Twitter to be the least used platform. However, the amount of Facebook followers by commission who have an account is extremely low. So Instagram followers are slightly higher, but not by much. And so although fewer commissions have Twitter accounts, more people follow commissions on Twitter than on Facebook and Instagram. So this is really important and interesting because it shows that the platform may matter just as much as the content they're sharing in and of itself. And the levels of engagement. But despite what I just said, one exception to this appears to be the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission, who is very, very active on Facebook. And they also host contests on social media to encourage engagement. Which was definitely one of the most innovative uses of social media that we saw. And they also use the Facebook analytics to inform what content they create and kind of who's using it. And then finally, an important distinction among jurisdictions is having the resources to create promotional materials such as advertisements on transit. And this was discussed more extensively with BC and Quebec. So Alberta, for example, used to be a bit more engaged in these tools, but again, the loss of the Human Rights Education Fund that we mentioned earlier really limited these options. And in BC, though, it appears to be that they're at the forefront of using resources for promotion. And although we still have to speak with Ontario, BC is using things like radio spots, ads on bus stops, digital ads, arts-based approaches, billboards, and more. And they were really the only ones to go that in depth. And then we also heard from BC and a few other jurisdictions about the use of infographics and experiential learning simulation sessions, which is quite interesting, and a few other more innovative type forms. And although it is too early to draw conclusions, our preliminary work suggests that there may be advantages to having a separate commission for human rights education. And then moving on from tools to what are the themes, what's the actual content in these tools that are being used. The three most common themes that we saw on commission websites for education resources are included introductions to human rights, race, and then disability. So introductions to human rights was definitely the most common form of education that we saw. And this typically meant that commissions were informing individuals about the legislation or how to file a complaint. Just quite general information. And so this also appeared to be a very common theme found and identified through interviews. And so perhaps the bulk of human rights education is focused more on helping people understand the statutes, how to file cases, and then also just overall awareness of the commission themselves. And then in terms of grounds, race was the focus of most educational materials found on commission websites, and references to race often referred to the experiences of Black Canadians. So for example, in 2020, the Saskatchewan Commission created and engaged in a symposium series called Framing African Descent Identities Through a Human Rights Lens. And in this series, viewers were educated on various issues related to Blackness, including mental health, language, and the economic costs of racism. And also we saw Nova Scotia create online training courses titled Serving All Customers Better, which was designed to help frontline service staff address and prevent consumer racial profiling. Another common theme that we saw was disability. And so most, again, had resources directly related to disability, but some, for example, was BC's YouTube series titled I Love My Human Rights, which employed storytelling to learn about human rights. And then also the Canadian, so the National Commission, has numerous resources on disability in the form of statements, reports, and YouTube videos. And other common themes that we found in our preliminary survey include sex and pregnancy, Indigenous peoples and reconciliation, gender and identity and gender expression, as well as a few other jurisdictions doing work on policing. And we also may add hate speech and immigration to this list, as they were discussed quite heavily in a lot of our interviews. And so most references to gender were associated with sexual harassment at the workplace. And these resources were aimed, I guess, towards employers in pursuit of minimizing instances of sexual harassment. So for example, PEI has a whole program, not just like a section. They received specific funding to create and develop a project titled Shift, which aims to address sexual harassment in the workplace through awareness, education, and training. And their target audience is employers, employees, high school students, and then also the general public. And other content discussed COVID-19 and the health, and then the healthcare system, housing, and place of origin, so immigration. And again, these were referenced quite often on commission websites, and there were comparable trends in this regard in BC, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And then housing was another common theme, and except for gender identity and expression, definitely stood out as an emerging area. So to be sure, housing has been a protected sector for decades, but it is now evolving and moving in different directions, such as cases involving sexual harassment in housing or claims to the right to affordable housing. So again, for an example, Manitoba has fact sheets on the discrimination in condominium housing and rental housing, but it is worth noting that these are over 10 years old, which definitely raises questions as to whether all of these resources can withstand time, and how do these things change over time, and are they always applicable? And then in 2017, Nova Scotia released a YouTube series titled Our Nova Scotia, which highlights the various grounds of discrimination, including place of origin, where stories of immigration and racism are shared. And then also the Federal Commission's work on housing education is a great example of content that could potentially be used and shared across multiple jurisdictions, not just limited to their own. And when we asked educational officers about their primary audiences, most mentioned employers, government agencies, employees, organized labor, youth, and educational institutions. And as we asked how commissions determined these priorities in developing educational content, we identified numerous sources of inspiration, including input from community groups, which is evidenced through Quebec's more formal, regular meetings with senior leadership teams, and also feedback from workshops and other public engagements, such as visiting rural, remote communities and hearing from them directly. And then also interactions with other government departments and agencies, and also nonprofit organizations who advocate and work on behalf of people experiencing discrimination. And then again, also to note that some more interesting too is using analytics of social media as well to inform their work. And so BC and possibly Ontario is unique in that educational priorities are informed by their Chief Commissioner's 5-year program. So in BC, the current priorities of this current commissioner are issues as such as decolonization, the environment, poverty, and hate speech. And again, hate speech was mentioned throughout several interviews, in addition to like decolonization and reconciliation. So educational priorities are also informed by the local context of the specific jurisdiction, such as, for example, immigration in PEI, New Brunswick, and Alberta. But the most common strategy for identifying priorities was cases, complaints, and inquiries to the Compliance or Complaints Division in each respective jurisdiction. This might partly explain why race and disability were the most common themes in educational resources that we saw, instead of things such as poverty or the environment.
That's great. Thank you, Jenna. So I'll wrap us up today by just raising a couple of issues that in terms of thinking about moving forward, how we might do an analysis. So the last formal interview of federal legislation by the government, this is almost 20 years ago, the inquiry lamented the excessive duplication among HRCs in Canada. It recommended, especially in the area of education, exploring ways to share resources. Now, we did ask in our interviews about sharing resources, and there is some coordination in Canada among human rights commissions, but not at the level envisioned by the federal inquiry. So Nova Scotia, for example, received a federal grant to adapt some of their educational tools for general use. I think it's 3 online courses. Several education officers mentioned networks formed through CASHRA to maintain a dialogue among institutions and to develop good practices and provide inspiration, for example, educational programs. But the obvious obstacle to greater collaboration, of course, is differences in the law. Case laws, statutes can differ by jurisdiction. So in that sense, the educational work of human rights commissions is to a degree restricted or limits opportunities for duplication. But there are at least 2 ways in which collaboration could help avoid duplication. First, we'd argue that sharing promotional materials like advertisements in public transit, these kind of materials have a general application. And the challenge there is not duplication, it's more, do other jurisdictions have the resources and the money to do that kind of advertising? And also in areas where commissions seek to develop a broader culture of rights, so challenge Canadians' ideas of rights by maybe drawing on international treaties, this is something that could be shared more among jurisdictions. Which leads to another quick point I'd like to raise, which is this idea of a culture of rights. This is something I think is worth exploring in terms of the mandate of human rights commissions. Now, although educational content in our survey focused mainly on the statutory mandate, most education, if not all education officers at human rights commissions, expressed an interest to us in addressing systemic issues and fostering a broader culture of rights. And so that can include, of course, talking about the current legal regime, but it can also include challenging Canadians' conceptions of rights by reframing issues like housing, the environment, or poverty, reframing them as equality issues and therefore as human rights issues. And of course, there would be no jurisdictional barrier to sharing that. We do have a bit of a hint of that in several jurisdictions. British Columbia's educational campaigns, for example, engage with issues around the environment, poverty, decolonization, social condition, and more. Ontario's Right to Read campaign is another great example that focused on issues around disability. And in Quebec, the Commission is engaged on issues like poverty and social condition. They've also engaged with a guaranteed minimum wage and the unique rights issues facing rural communities. So, to be sure, there are challenges in engaging beyond a Commission's remit. Commissions are expected to be neutral arbiters. And so, among other things, chief commissioners hesitate to comment on issues that might later come before a tribunal, for instance. So while commissions might wish to engage with issues like a right to water, we did discover that there are pressures on them to focus on their statutory. So just to wrap up then, I'd like to start with a quote from Blair Mason, who's a former chair of the Alberta Human Rights Commission. He used to insist that education was a central feature of human rights law. He says, quote, education is the greatest form of prevention because what you understand, you don't fear. Every time you're able to establish teamwork with different cultures and you begin to realize the uniformity of human nature, regardless of our race, creed, whatever, and the richness of that diversity, you begin to appreciate how a strong society could be if all that was integrated. And there's another quote I like from the International and Human Rights Law Association where they write, education is the foundation upon which the whole human rights project rests. So moving forward in our project, now you've got a sense of our preliminary findings, some of the issues that we're thinking about considering in evaluating Human Rights Commission's engagement with education include, for example, first of all, not as many jurisdictions than we anticipated seem to be focusing efforts on ensuring that educational materials were translated into multiple languages. Some jurisdictions, PEI, New Brunswick, BC, Northwest Territories stood out in this regard, but it wasn't as common as we thought it would be. Second, it's interesting that there did not seem to be a focus on internal education or internal training for the staff at Human Rights Commissions, although we did hear this from BC, they might be the exception, which I think is an issue worth exploring, especially considering recent developments with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Thirdly, I mentioned that the Universal Declaration, the one on human rights education and training, that there's no doubt that human rights commissions engage with the first two criteria. So they do about and they do through. But that third principle, for, which encourages learners to translate human rights knowledge into practice. In other words, examining real life events such as bullying and stereotyping through a human rights lens. Do human rights commissions do this? Should it be their responsibility to do so? These are some of the questions we want to explore a little bit in moving forward. It was also encouraging that in our interviews, most commissions didn't feel constrained by their statutory mandates. Many insisted that they were in a position to advocate for fostering a culture of rights and challenging our preconceptions about rights. So I think that's worth mentioning because it really is interesting about the potential for human rights commissions to do more. It is also worth mentioning that the most common theme in our interviews, and this is what I want to wrap up with, was lack of resources and challenges of reduced budgets. This issue comes up all the time, and the numbers we showed you earlier, I think, suggest why that is the case. This has a widespread impact on human rights commissions and on human rights education because it makes it difficult. Without resources, you struggle to keep up to date on current issues. Most of the funding, of course, goes to staff. And as a result, there's also a lack of resources to create and generate educational tools. In addition, while all human rights commissions were conscious of the need to reach out to rural communities, and places where their offices were not located, a lack of resources made this challenging. Although we did hear from them about a commitment to try to do this anyway. And in fact, some commissions, the situation is so dire that they simply have no educational unit in the commission. There's a couple of commissions that just unfortunately are not doing education. So where do we go from here? Well, our preliminary work focuses on examining budgets and documenting tools and themes for HRE. Our current plan in moving forward is to focus our research on developing metrics and methodology for those best or good practices and educational tools in the hopes of collaborating further with human rights commissions. So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to us. We hope you found it interesting and engaging. We're welcome to take questions. I'm noticing that there's a chat space and a Q&A space, so I'll keep an eye on both. Feel free to throw a question in there. I'll keep an eye out. We can answer them. I might actually, apologies, Jenna, I'll put you a little bit on the spot there, Jenna, but I noticed in our final draft, I'll just ask you a quick question while waiting for others to throw some questions in there. We didn't have it in our final draft, but you made a great point about the Northwest Territories knowing their audience. I think it was youth and others. Could you speak just for a minute to what you learned in that interview? Is really interesting about them knowing their audience.
Yeah, so for I guess a bit of background, the Northwest Territories doesn't have a lot of budget. So I think the reason why this is quite fascinating is they're doing really innovative work with lack of resources. So they rely quite heavily on their Facebook account for both engagement, but also their main source of education with the communities, especially given just the amount of remote communities in the Northwest Territories. And so they have put quite a bit of both work, but also some of the money, the budget that they do have for education into their Facebook to try and engage with people. And one of the ways that we kind of briefly mentioned on is through contests. And so they've done this for a few years now, where they now host contests a bit more consistently, I guess, throughout the year, but they do have one, which I actually think might be this week, because it typically falls on the same the same event of this very conference, is they do a draw and a contest to win an iPad, because they know obviously that's going to get people interested and everyone would love to have an iPad. And so they post questions on their Facebook account, and asking people to reshare and like and whatnot. And that has been like a very helpful way for them to gain traction. But another kind of benefit that their Facebook has given them is he described that when you're on Facebook and you're on like the business side of Facebook, if you can add, boost engagement by paying X amount, they always do that because they know they'll reach more people. And then another benefit is these Facebook analytics. So they'll look at the back end of their Facebook analytics and it'll give them a breakdown of who's actually visiting their page. And so what they know is that the most frequent and most common population, I guess, viewing their content is women aged like 30 to 40. And so he described that they know within this population, within their jurisdiction, this quite commonly refers to single mothers. And so they'll really aim and target their content to education that could be shared with youth or young kids, because they know mothers will see it and they'll share it with their children. But on the flip side, they also see, okay, we have a lot of 30-year-old women looking at our content. How can we also try and boost interactions, awareness, and education towards men? So yeah, it's interesting in that it completely shapes the content they share and they create, and makes them think, how can we create more content to reach people that we aren't reaching as of right now? So yeah, it was a fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. Jen, I'll just offer some initial answers, but please feel free to jump in as well too if you've got some thoughts on those. The point about metrics and indicators is a great question. Jenna, you might recall that we did ask the people we interviewed if you have any way of evaluating or having measures to determine the impact of their educational programs. I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, Jenna, that all of them said they don't really have any metrics to use now. But Jenna's recent interviews with the Northwest Territories is a great, in her answer, there was a great example of how you can use metrics. In this case, I thought it was fascinating that they're conscious of a demographic that included single mothers and youth. And they knew this through their social media and therefore were shaping some content in that regard. I thought, so that was one way they can use metrics. Part of the challenges, as Jenna pointed out in her discussion, is the social media following is pretty small with a few exceptions. So those metrics don't work really well. Mostly the feedback commissions get is when they do workshops or public engagement. They tell us that they ask for feedback on those presentations, which shouldn't be dismissed. Nova Scotia, when we interviewed the person there, they've just done a huge conference on youth and human rights. So they do get some good feedback that way. But I think by and large, does that sound right, Jenna, that they don't really have ways of identifying the impact of their work?
Yeah, you're right. Also, I don't know how to see the questions.
I clicked on session and then Q&A. There should be there's chat, polls, people, and Q&A if you want to see those there.
I'm scared to see anything, so I'll just let you take the lead and then direct me.
Another question, thank you for this, about beyond intercommission sharing and coordination activity. Did the study looked at commissions partnering with Indigenous peoples, civil society, or community-based groups and organisms? So that's a great question, especially because human rights education outside of Canada is almost entirely done by those groups. They don't really have the institutions that we do here. There's two quick answers to your question. One is that we have, on the one hand, we have not gone to look at the kind of work that, for example, civil society groups are doing and how that might complement or interact with commissions. So that is something forthcoming. We focus so far on commissions. Secondly, but we did ask in the commissioners or the educational officers about partnering. And I think I can say with confidence that they saw this as the most important thing that they did. So priorities for education was informed to a degree by cases and inquiries, but that was also just as important in informing their priorities. When they would talk to civil society groups, talk to nonprofits, engage with Indigenous peoples, this is what was inspiring and informing their work. And in Quebec, for instance, I think Quebec was the most formalized, in which senior leadership would meet at least a couple of times a year in a formal roundtable where they would meet with community groups, and that would determine their priorities. In BC, the commissioner sets priorities for their 5-year term, but they are informed by their interactions. So to answer your question, it hasn't been quite an explicit focus yet, but we did get a sense from the interviews that these kind of interactions are deeply important to how commissions. Any thoughts on that, Jenna, or does that sit consistently with what you've heard?
Yeah, I think so. And even just to shed light, I guess, a bit on Nova Scotia as well. Nova Scotia really stressed the importance of collaborating with different community groups because they're able to, they wanted to educate community groups quite heavily because they knew that those community groups are who's going to be working hand in hand on the front line, working with the folks who may then later on come before the commission. So yeah, I definitely think that it's an emerging area that is recognized of importance.
Fantastic. And it's funny, I didn't see that the chat must have refreshed because I didn't see, there's some great comments, some great discussion in the chat talking about civil and political rights and talking about UDHR. So I just encourage everybody to take a look at that. So I'm just noticing the chat comments here. And, in addition to commission education, formal HRE, maybe better reach groups who may not be formalized or have institutional sources. One of the comments in the chat that stood out to me, I think that's a great point about needing to go beyond people who are well organized or groups who are well organized. In fact, given the mandate of human rights commissions and I think JHC's recent report highlights this as well too, the importance of working with marginalized populations. That's a great point about trying to find ways to reach those groups. Another question I'm seeing here in the chat, what is the likelihood or sentiment right now being human rights commissions to share educational and promotional resources? My sense, and feel free to add to this, Jenna, was that it really wasn't something that it came up a lot. And I don't mean that as a critique, but the way in which human rights commissions are set up, they're rather siloed. And there are some forums for communication and collaboration, but not a lot of sharing there. And we're not sure if it's from a lack of resources or if it's a sense that their mandate is too different. But we thought we'd get more out of that question. And many of the people we spoke to said, it's an interesting idea, but we really don't share resources. Was that your takeaway as well too, Jenna?
Yeah, I felt there were kind of two answers at the polar end. There were, I would say, the bulk saying exactly what you're sharing, and in that they were kind of a little bit hesitant based on the perhaps jurisdictional differences. But then there were also a few others who were quite open in saying, that's kind of ridiculous. We shouldn't be limited by those things. We can just give a little bit of a disclaimer. So it was interesting because we definitely got both answers. And PEI, for example, specifically mentions that she uses the BC YouTube videos in her education with the community, and then just kind of stops at the end of it and says, okay, so this is BC. This is actually how it works in PEI. So there's a bit of both. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I forgot about that. That's right. That did come up in the interview, didn't it? Another question I'm seeing in the Q&A, this is interesting. Somebody is familiar with my past work about comparing Canada and Australia. And they ask, how would you compare and contrast the progress of each country at this juncture with a focus on Indigenous rights in UNDRIP? Now, admittedly, this is not an issue that I've specialized in, and it has been a few years since I did my research in Australia. Well, it wasn't that long ago where I gave a presentation in New Zealand with their Human Rights Commission. The best thing I can say to that question is that Canada has faced some severe budget cuts when it comes to human rights commissions over the past 7 to 10 years. Like Jenna mentioned, with the exception of a few jurisdictions, at least when adjusted for inflation, virtually every jurisdiction has lost funding. Even Quebec that hasn't, it's very little. But we make the argument that Alberta is by far the worst off. Alberta has, in inflation-adjusted dollars, a budget that's 30% less than it was in 2015-16. I mention that because Australia, it's even worse. It's way worse. They've seen budget cuts of almost 50% in that country. And as for those people who know Australia, their recent referendum has failed. And it's hard, and this is purely conjecture, it is hard to not see a correlation between the failure of that referendum and the severe budget cuts that the federal commission at least has faced in that country. They do virtually no education whatsoever. So it's not to say that things are rosy in Canada. I think our stats show that they're very much not, but it is worse in other places. And the usual comparators with Canada are New Zealand, Australia, Ireland. And with the exception of Ireland, all have faced even more severe budget cuts. So this is a global issue. It's not just in Canada. Okay, well, I believe I'll just take a quick look at the chat. I think that's the end of our questions, and we're running out of time. There's only about a minute and a half left. Don't want to put you on the spot, but Jenna, do you have any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with the group about generally what you've learned about human rights education as we wrap up?
I don't know. I feel like I'm interesting to do this work because I'm really not familiar with human rights education too much prior to joining this project. So it's been interesting because I've also been able to kind of see how the education that they're providing is working, because I'm also like seeking it to learn. So it's been really interesting, and yeah, like seeing just the differences in every jurisdiction has been really fascinating.
Great, thank you. And I might just add as a final quick 30-second comment that I come into this as an historical sociologist, so somebody who studies these developments contemporarily, but in a historical context. And so I can't help but emphasize that the original mandate for human rights commissions was prevention. It was never the intent that they would focus vast majority of their resources on processing complaints, because that would be impossible to address all complaints. It had to be prevention and education. But budget cuts and funding cuts have forced commissions to put aside education to the detriment of education to focus on cases, which is deeply unfortunate because there's these amazing, dedicated, hardworking people working at the commissions. You talk with them, you see that they really believe in what they're doing. And when they have to have a conversation as a team to whether or not they can afford, $300 for a Zoom application or something, it really does says how much they're struggling. We hope as we move forward in the future to draw more attention about the importance of education mandate. So with that, we will wrap up. I want to thank everybody for attending our presentation. I want to thank again the conference organizers for putting together it's been a phenomenal conference in this recent period. We've really enjoyed it. We hope you find our presentation. Have a good afternoon, everybody, and we'll see you in the next session.
See you.